The field was on fire. Smoke poured across the frozen ground of northeastern France, thick and black, swallowing the January sky. Through that smoke, 6 German tanks were rolling forward, iron monsters flanked by 250 elite infantry troops, boots crunching through the snow, bayonets fixed, advancing in a wall of steel and fury. And standing in their way alone was a 19-year-old boy from Texas, not on solid ground, not in a foxhole, not behind a wall. He was standing on top of a burning tank destroyer. The vehicle beneath him was already hit, already on fire, already in danger of exploding at any moment. The heat rising from the hull would have been suffocating. Shrapnel and machine gun rounds were tearing the air around him. He had taken a wound to the leg. His men had already retreated into the woods behind him. He stayed. For 1 full hour, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy stood on that burning wreck, working the .50 caliber machine gun, pouring fire into the advancing enemy, directing artillery strikes by phone, killing and wounding soldiers by the dozens, until the Germans finally turned around and walked away. Then the turret he had been standing on exploded. He was already gone. This is the story of the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. A dirt-poor kid from a sharecropper's shack who dropped out of school in the 5th grade. A young man who was rejected by the Marines, rejected by the Navy, and barely scraped into the Army by falsifying his own age. A soldier who went on to receive every single combat decoration the United States had to offer, plus honors from France and Belgium. This is the story of Audie Murphy, and it begins a long, long way from France. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the perfect time. We tell true stories of real courage, the kind that Hollywood can barely touch. Hit that subscribe button and let's go back to Texas. Kingston, Texas. Hunt County, 1925. It was not a place that produced legends. It was a place that produced cotton. Miles and miles of flat, dry Texas farmland, worked by families who barely owned the clothes on their backs. Sharecroppers, men and women who farmed land they didn't own, giving a portion of whatever they grew to the landowner, keeping just enough to survive. Audie Murphy was born into that world on June 20th, 1925. He was the 7th of 12 children, born to Emmett Barry Murphy and his wife Josie Bell. The family had Irish and Scots-Irish roots, people who had come to America with nothing and built a life with their hands. But the Depression had ground that life down to almost nothing at all. As a small child, Audie was wiry, quick-eyed, and restless. He had a fierce temper and a loner's instinct. The other children on neighboring farms might have played at being cowboys. Audie was already responsible for real things, real hunger, real survival. His father, Emmett, drifted in and out. The man would disappear for days at a time, gone to find work, gone to find something easier than responsibility. When Audie was around 11 or 12 years old, Emmett Murphy walked out on the family for the last time. He simply never came back. That left Josie, already worn thin by poverty and too many children, to hold things together. And it left young Audie to step into a role no boy should have to fill. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade. 5th grade. He was barely 10 years old, and he was already a working man. He hired out to neighboring farms, plowing fields and picking cotton for $1 a day. He hunted small game with a rifle, rabbits, squirrels, because whatever he brought home was food on the table. It wasn't sport, it was survival. And those years of hunting on the flat Texas plains turned him into a marksman of remarkable precision. He learned to make every shot count because sometimes there was only one shell. He once said, in the plain way he had of speaking, that he was thrown into the struggle for existence from the very beginning. He wasn't exaggerating. In 1941, when Audie was 16 years old, his mother Josie died. She had been ill for some time, slowly failing as the years and hardship wore her down. When she passed on May 23, 1941, the Murphy household collapsed entirely. The younger children were placed in an orphanage. Audie was left alone. He was 16. He had no parents, no education past elementary school, no money, and no real future waiting for him in the cotton fields of Hunt County. But on December 7, 1941, just 7 months after his mother's death, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And everything changed. Audie Murphy heard the news and made up his mind immediately. He was going to war. He tried the Marines first. They took one look at the slight, baby-faced boy in front of them and turned him away. Too small, too young. He tried the paratroopers. Same answer. He tried the Navy. No. Audie Murphy was 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed around 110 pounds. He had the face of a child because he was a child. But his older sister helped him falsify his birth certificate, adding a year to his age to help him qualify. He went to the Army, and somehow the Army said yes. He enlisted in June of 1942 at the age of 17, though the paperwork said 18. He did his basic training at Camp Wolters, Texas, not far from the cotton fields he'd grown up working. Advanced training followed at Fort Meade, Maryland. His commanders noticed immediately that he could shoot. The kid from Texas, who'd spent years putting food on the table with a rifle, was, naturally, one of the best marksmen they'd ever seen. He was assigned to the 15th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division, the Rock of the Marne, one of the most storied divisions in the entire American Army. And then they sent him to war. His first taste of combat came in Sicily in the summer of 1943. Murphy was a private, fresh-faced and green, stepping onto a battlefield for the first time. He later described what he saw on that beach, the bodies, the destruction, the sheer staggering reality of men at war, as something that hit him like a wall. He had wanted combat. Now he understood what he'd asked for. But he didn't flinch. Through the Italian campaign, through Anzio, through the brutal grinding warfare of the European theater, Audie Murphy proved himself time and again. He earned promotions, he earned decorations, he earned the respect of the men around him and the officers above him. By the fall of 1944, the young private who'd barely been allowed to enlist was accepting a battlefield commission as a second lieutenant. A fighter who had entered the war with nothing to his name now led men in combat. He received a Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts. With each action, the legend of Audie Murphy grew a little larger within the 3rd Infantry Division. But nothing, none of it, would come close to what was waiting for him in the winter of 1945. By January of that year, the war in Europe was in a desperate final phase. Germany was losing. Everyone knew it. But the Germans were not finished fighting, and they proved it in spectacular and bloody fashion. In December 1944, Hitler had launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, pushing American lines back in a wave of steel and fury. The Allies had ultimately held, and the Germans were retreating, but they were not broken. On New Year's Eve, Germany launched its last major offensive on the Western Front, Operation Northwind. The goal was to exploit the chaos of the Bulge and destroy 2 Allied armies. Once again, American and French forces fought desperately through January 1945 to stop the advance and push the Wehrmacht back across the Rhine. And in the middle of all this, in the snow and the cold and the chaos of Alsace, in eastern France, a powerful German force of more than 30,000 men had dug in around the city of Colmar. They called it the Colmar Pocket, a 40-mile-long, 30-mile-deep bulge of enemy-held territory that the Allies simply could not leave behind them. If those German troops broke out, if they managed to push north and strike the advancing Allied armies from behind, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The 3rd Infantry Division was ordered to reduce the Colmar Pocket. Audie Murphy and Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, were in the middle of it. The ground north of Holtzwihr, France, a small village in the heart of the Colmar Pocket, was as miserable as any battlefield in the war. The temperature had dropped far below freezing. Snow lay deep over the fields and forests. The frozen earth made it nearly impossible to dig foxholes. The Bois de Riedwehr, a large forest just north of Holtzwihr, was a labyrinth of shadow and ice, and the Germans inside it had turned every tree line into a fortified killing ground. On January 23, 1945, the 30th Infantry Regiment advanced through that forest and ran into a wall of German tanks and infantry. They were caught in the open, unable to dig in, and they were torn apart. The 30th was ordered to withdraw, battered and reduced. Murphy's Company B was rushed in to hold the line. But Company B was already a ghost of what it should have been. Weeks of hard fighting had reduced the unit to a fraction of its authorized strength. The men who remained were exhausted, cold, and outnumbered. Murphy himself had only recently returned to action. He had been wounded in mid-January, shot in both legs during fighting near Holzwihr, and he had come back to his men before the wounds were fully healed, because that was simply who he was. He worked through the night, trying to establish a defensive position along the edge of the forest. By morning, he had been reinforced with 2 tank destroyers from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, M10s, open-topped armored vehicles carrying a 76mm gun and a 50 caliber machine gun on the turret. He used them along with a handful of other armored vehicles to anchor his thin defensive line. He could see the village of Holzwihr from where he stood, heavily defended, a cluster of stone buildings packed with German soldiers and armor. Word came through, the expected reinforcements would not arrive that day. Company B would have to hold. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on January 26, 1945. The light was thin and gray, the way winter light in France always is, pale and cold and somehow tired. Murphy was at his command post at the edge of the Bois d'Idvir, the forest at his back, the open fields in the village ahead of him. Then he saw them. 6 German tanks rolling out of Holzwihr. Panzers, iron and steel moving across the snow, trailing exhaust, turrets traversing as their crews locked onto targets. Behind the tanks, 250 German mountain troops, elite soldiers, well-trained and well-armed, advancing in a line across the frozen fields. This was not a probe. This was not a skirmish. This was a full assault aimed at destroying Company B, punching through the American line, and opening a corridor that could threaten the entire Allied operation in the sector. Murphy got on the phone. He called for artillery. The shells began to fall among the advancing Germans, and for a few minutes the fire slowed them, tore at their ranks, bought precious time. But the tanks kept coming, the infantry kept coming, and Company B, outnumbered, outgunned, already weakened, began to buckle. Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to the prepared positions deeper in the woods. The forest would give them cover, give them a fighting chance. One by one and in small groups, his soldiers pulled back into the tree line. Murphy stayed. He remained at his forward command post, alone in the open, working the phone, continuing to direct artillery fire onto the advancing enemy. Shells walked across the field, and the German infantry took casualties, but there were hundreds of them, and they kept coming. Then, off to his right, one of the M10 tank destroyers took a direct hit. The vehicle shuddered, smoke billowed from the hull, and flames began to lick up through the open top. The crew scrambled out and ran for the woods. The M10 was burning, and in that burning vehicle, above the smoke and the flames, the 50 caliber machine gun was still mounted on the turret. Audie Murphy looked at that burning tank destroyer. Then he looked at the 6 German tanks rolling toward him across the snow. Then he looked at the 250 German infantry moving up behind them, close enough now that he could make out faces. He had one option left. He climbed up. No one can be entirely certain what went through his mind in that moment. Murphy himself, when asked about it later, always spoke quietly and without drama. He had a way of describing things that were almost superhuman, as if they were simply the obvious next thing to do. But those who knew him, the men who fought beside him, the officers who led him, understood that this was not recklessness. This was a calculation, made in a fraction of a second, by a young man who had spent 3 years learning the cold mathematics of survival on a battlefield. The burning M10 sat slightly forward of the German advance. Its hull was blocking some of the enemy's line of sight. The smoke pouring from the vehicle, thick, black, billowing, provided a form of concealment. If he could get up there, get behind that gun, he could put fire on the approaching infantry without them knowing exactly where it was coming from. The ground below him could blow at any moment. An ammunition fire inside the hull could tear the whole vehicle apart in an instant. The heat alone was intense enough to be dangerous. German rifles, machine guns, and tank main guns were all focused in his direction. He climbed up anyway. He got behind the 50 caliber. He opened fire. For the next hour, Audie Murphy fought alone on the top of a burning tank destroyer in the middle of a field in France. He worked the gun in controlled bursts, sweeping the advancing enemy infantry, cutting them down in the open snow. He spotted a German squad crawling through a drainage ditch to his right, trying to creep around his flank without being seen. He traversed the barrel and opened fire. The squad was wiped out where they lay. Between bursts on the machine gun, he kept the phone to his ear, directing artillery fire onto the German armor. The combination of the .50 caliber cutting through the infantry and the artillery working on the tanks began, slowly, to halt the German advance. The Germans threw everything they had at him: machine gun fire from the infantry, main gun rounds from the tanks, mortar rounds. The turret and hull around him were struck again and again. At some point during the fight, a round hit near enough to wound his leg, the same leg, it is said, that had already been hit weeks before. He kept firing. Murphy later described the German infantry getting close enough that he could speak to them almost conversationally, men creeping up through the smoke, thinking they had found a dead machine, only to be cut down when the gun came to life again. He said some of them got within 10 yards before they were stopped. 10 yards, less than the length of a room. The smoke that rose from the burning hull around him worked both for and against him. It gave him cover, made it harder for the Germans to pinpoint exactly where the fire was coming from, but it also reduced his visibility, letting enemy soldiers get closer than he might have liked before he saw them. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, if the gun went silent, the German infantry would pour into the gap, overwhelm the few men he had in the woods behind him, and Company B would be gone. Every man he'd ordered to fall back would be encircled, trapped, and destroyed. He kept firing. The Germans had expected to roll over an understrength American company, punch through the forest, and open a corridor that could change the entire strategic picture in the Colmar pocket. Instead, they found themselves being eaten alive by a single machine gun mounted on a vehicle that should have already exploded. For a full hour, the attack stalled. The artillery fire directed by Murphy tore great gaps in the German formations. The .50 caliber swept the snow-covered fields, cutting down anyone who tried to rush forward. The 6 tanks maneuvered, looking for angles, but the combination of artillery and machine gun fire made advancing costly. Gradually, then decisively, the German force began to pull back. And then Murphy's phone went dead. The artillery connection was cut. He was out of ammunition for the machine gun. He had nothing left. He climbed down from the turret. He rejoined his men in the woods, walking on a wounded leg, refusing the medics who tried to treat him immediately. He had something else to do first. He began to plan a counterattack. With the Germans in retreat and his men still, miraculously, in one piece, Murphy reorganized what was left of Company B and led them back out of the woods. They retook the ground that the Germans had advanced over just an hour before. They pushed the enemy back toward Holzwehr. And then, after Murphy had left the vehicle, after his men were safely moving, the turret of the burning M10 exploded. It blew skyward. Company B held through the night. The following day, the reinforced 30th Infantry Regiment moved up and captured the village of Holzwehr. The road that had been the German objective, the road that ran directly through Murphy's position, stayed in American hands. The official Medal of Honor citation, issued by War Department General Orders on August 9, 1945, and signed by General George C. Marshall, describes Murphy's actions in the spare language of military documentation. It records that he directed artillery fire, which killed large numbers of the advancing enemy infantry, that he climbed onto the burning tank destroyer while it was in danger of blowing up at any moment, that Germans reached as close as 10 yards before being stopped, and that his actions saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction. The citation also notes that he killed or wounded approximately 50 enemy soldiers during the engagement. On June 2, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented Murphy with the Medal of Honor at an airfield near Werfen, Austria. Murphy was 20 years old. He had already received every other combat decoration the United States Army had to offer: the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor devices, 3 Purple Hearts, the Legion of Merit, French and Belgian decorations for valor, more than 30 medals in total. He was the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. He was also a boy from a sharecropper's shack who had never finished grade school. He came home in the summer of 1945. Life magazine put him on the cover. Young, handsome, barely out of his teens, wearing his uniform and his impossible collection of medals. The caption called him the most decorated soldier in America. The country fell in love with him. Actor James Cagney saw the Life cover and reached out. "Come to Hollywood," Cagney said. Murphy went, reluctantly. He was uncomfortable with attention, uncomfortable with praise, always quick to deflect credit to the men who had served alongside him. He once said that he didn't like being called the most decorated soldier because there were so many guys who should have gotten medals and never did, guys who were killed. But Hollywood wanted him, and he eventually gave it a try. He made more than 40 films over the next 2 decades. Westerns, mostly, and it wasn't hard to see why. The same qualities that had made him lethal on a battlefield translated naturally to the frontier hero. The quiet confidence, the economy of movement, the eyes that had seen too much but gave nothing away. He played outlaws and sheriffs and soldiers and pioneers. He became one of the most popular actors in America. In 1949, he wrote a memoir called To Hell and Back. It became a bestseller. In 1955, Universal Pictures adapted it for film, and Murphy played himself, recreating, on screen, the very moments of courage and horror that had made him famous. The film was Universal's highest-grossing movie for many years. But behind the screen, behind the cameras, behind the easy smile that had charmed an entire country, something else was happening. Audie Murphy came home from the war with wounds that no medal could describe. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was known then as battle fatigue, or shell shock. Men were expected to simply get over it. The idea that war left invisible damage on the mind was barely acknowledged, and to speak of it publicly was to risk being seen as weak. Murphy couldn't sleep. He had nightmares every night, violent and vivid, pulling him back to the burning fields of France and the frozen forests of Italy. He kept a loaded handgun under his pillow because without it, he didn't feel safe. He would wake up in a cold sweat, sometimes vomiting, with crushing headaches. By the mid-1960s, he had become dependent on a prescribed sedative called Placidil, using it night after night just to get a few hours of sleep. When he finally recognized the addiction for what it was, he checked himself into a motel room alone and went cold turkey. He locked the door, threw away the pills, and suffered through a week of by himself, and he came out the other side. And then he started talking. He became one of the first public figures in American life to speak openly about battle fatigue, about the inner cost of war, the invisible wounds that soldiers carried home in silence. He called on the government to study the emotional impact of combat. He pushed for expanded healthcare benefits for veterans. He said publicly and with the full weight of his authority as the most celebrated soldier in American history that what happened to the mind in war was real, was serious, and deserved treatment. The country wasn't entirely ready to hear it, but he said it anyway. 5 months after his death, legislation was introduced by Congressman Olin Teague. In 1973, the Audie L. Murphy Memorial VA Hospital was dedicated in San Antonio, Texas. It stands today as part of the South Texas Veterans Healthcare System. He was fighting for his fellow veterans right up until the end. On May 28, 1971, a twin-engine plane went down near Roanoke, Virginia. The weather was poor, visibility low. The aircraft failed to clear the mountain ridge. Audie Murphy was among those on board. He was 45 years old. He died on Memorial Day weekend. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. He had previously requested that his headstone be kept plain. No gold leaf, no embellishment, just his name and his service. A simple stone among thousands of simple stones. It has become one of the most visited graves in Arlington. People come from across the country to stand before it. Veterans and their families, history students, children who have heard the name but don't yet know the story, people who simply want to stand near something true. There is a question that runs through the life of Audie Murphy, underneath all the medals and the movies and the magazine covers. How does a boy like that become a man like that? How does a child who grew up with nothing, no money, no parents, no education, climb onto a burning tank destroyer while 6 enemy tanks and 250 soldiers are trying to kill him and simply refuse to leave? Part of the answer is the obvious one. The army trained him, gave him skills and discipline, put him in situations that revealed what he was made of. And what he was made of was exceptional. But there is another part of the answer, one that Murphy himself pointed to when he spoke about his past. The years of poverty had not broken him. They had forged him. Hunting alone in the Texas brush country, where one shot had to count. Watching over younger siblings when his father was gone and his mother was sick. Learning, before he was old enough to shave, that survival required absolute focus and the refusal to give up. The cotton fields of Hunt County, Texas, had produced in Audie Murphy a quality that no military training could have manufactured from scratch. He already knew what it meant to have nothing to fall back on. On that burning tank destroyer, in that frozen field in France, he was just doing what he had always done. He was holding the line. The German advance in the Colmar pocket was eventually broken. By January 28, 1945, just 2 days after Murphy's stand at Holzwihr, the areas east of the Ill River and north of the Colmar Canal were cleared of German forces. The threat that had hung over the Allied advance into Germany was eliminated. Historians who have analyzed the strategic picture have noted what might have happened if the German breakthrough had succeeded. The overstretched 7th Army could have been routed. The 3rd Army, driving east, could have been hit from behind. The port of Antwerp, the lifeline of Allied logistics, could have been threatened. In the worst case, the Allied advance into Germany could have been set back by months. Murphy held the line, one 19-year-old boy on a burning tank in a frozen field for 1 hour. He never said he was a hero. He said he didn't deserve more credit than the men who died beside him. He said he was just doing his job. But here is what the record shows. When the Germans came with 6 tanks and 250 men and everything they had, Audie Murphy stood alone between them and his soldiers, and he did not yield 1 inch of ground. That is what it looks like when a country produces a man equal to its greatest crisis. That is what courage looks like when it is tested to the absolute limit. That is Audie Murphy, and the woods still stand. If this story moved you, and I believe it should, hit the subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment below and tell us, what part of Audie Murphy's life stayed with you? And if you know someone who should hear this story, a veteran, a history lover, someone who needs to be reminded what real courage looks like, share this video with them. Ring that bell, like this video, and we'll see you in the next one.